Welcome to the Green Living Chats, brought to you by EcoWamet Solutions Ghana. I'm your host, David. Ecosystem. According to the National Geography, ecosystem is a geographical area where plants, animals, and other organisms, as well as weather and landscape, work together to form a bubble of life. Well, within the ecosystems, there are so many interactions that goes on, but there is this organism named humans who have special impact on the ecosystem. In the early 1980s, there was a term that was established, biodiversity, because of the human impact and influence that they thought that might be having on the diverse species in the ecosystem. Reports have confirmed that climate change and other human activities have impact, and organisms are expected to adapt to the changes in the future as it unveils. To an extent, we have no idea how biodiversity is being affected by human activities. Well, we know that at least for now, some organisms are being affected. Today I'm being joined by an ecologist who is interested in the evolution of some specific traits that contribute to adaptive plasticity in reptiles. He is also interested in the role of environment in shaping the adaptation of wildlife and how wildlife can be conserved. I'm joined here today with Gideon Deme Gywa, who is a researcher under the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Let's get into it. Hello, Gideon. Welcome to the Green Living Chats.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, David. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey because I think we started having certain conversations about latter part of last year, and I'm really glad that we can finally have a conversation on areas where we find common interest.
Yeah, I think it's also an area that is driving my passion. So I don't just study because I just want to study. I think it's one of the passion that I have. And that was why when you approached me with the issue, I was very happy to share my views and my thoughts on some of the certain issues that we have around the topic of discourse.
Yeah. Okay. So, this section is actually, this segment is called research stories. And what we do normally is that we interview people with research backgrounds, and we just want to get the results and the experience that they have gained academically and want to relate it to what is happening in the real industry and the world itself. I've read a couple of your articles, and the trend from your Google Scholar details shows that you have studied in Nigeria. I think you're originally from Nigeria, and currently, I presume you are in China, right? In Beijing specifically. How has this journey been, and where did you start getting this interest in ecological systems, and all that?
Okay. To start with, I'm from Nigeria, a very small hub called Ganauri, where we are surrounded by mountains. And growing up, I didn't grow up, so to say, in the high class. I grew up from a very humble background. So farming was one of the key things that kept the economy of my family. So I was an active farmer when I was growing up. And it was from the resources we got from the farming that I was able to go to school. Now, growing up, I had the opportunity of meeting my grandparents, and I asked a lot of questions around the ecosystem. But whenever you ask me what I wanted to become, it was a different story altogether. not until when I got into the high school, the secondary school, as we call it in Nigeria. And it will interest you to know that biology was one of the least science courses I used to score,
Wow.
where I was good in mathematics, physics, chemistry, but biology was, I was around the good, so to say, around 60, 70.
Hmm.
And when I got to the university, I was just studying biology blindly until I met this great man named Professor Malan, who was actually my mentor at 300 level, where he taught us about insects. And that really made me to start asking some questions around, so how do these insects live? How diverse are they? What actually happens between them and the ecosystem? And that made it possible for me to go into my first research, even though my first research was not ecologically related, so to say. But if you look at the wide range of biodiversity, I was actually in line because I was trying to see how medicinal plants could be used to treat malaria, which is a common problem in Nigeria and the sub-Saharan Africa. So that is part of the ecosystem services. Now, going further, after that, he encouraged me to come back for my master's
In the same
because
university.
in the same university. As a young man, I needed something. I wanted to go into the industry, look for a
Yeah.
job, get
Mm-hmm.
some money, start up life. But he told me, no, you have the ability of being a good researcher. So why not try to come back for masters? It was a talk of war between the two of us. But for the respect I have for him, I had to apply. And then, okay, coming back for masters, I took interest mostly into, okay, if I'm trying to treat the malaria, why not let's look at the source of the malaria? And that was where I now went into now research some of the environmental factors that affects the breeding pattern of mosquitoes. And the result I got was interesting because I was able to establish that alkalinity helps in breeding more of the Culex species than the Anopheles. And I picked interest in ecology. When I saw that particular result, I said, wow, that means studying the environment and how it affects animals
Yeah.
will be a great thing
Will be a
to
great thing.
venture in.
At that
Yeah,
time, did it look
I
very fruitful for you? I mean, aside it being interesting, did it look like something that could get you to, let's say, I mean, every young guy is looking at getting a good profession that can give a lot of money and all that. Were you thinking about that?
Yeah, in fact, it became very fruitful when this same man that I'm talking about, that's the Professor Malan, was able to attract a tech fund grant that looked at
Oh, there you
the
go.
biodiversity loss of insects in the last 30 years in the federal capital. And he now co-opted me as a research assistant.
That's
So,
beautiful.
and I got some good monies from it. And that also motivated me to, okay, try to. And then one of my seniors back then in the university also, who was studying in China by then for his PhD, also got some grants on biodiversity of butterflies and some reptiles. And he approached me through that our supervisor that he wants me to render some help.
Mm-hmm.
And that was how I gradually got interested because each time I
Wow.
go out to the field, I try to see something interesting that can excite me. And then aside that, a lot of grants were available for conservation and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
biodiversity.
Yeah. Wow. This is an interesting story. But then
Yeah.
I mean, I saw in one of your articles that you growing up and you started getting interest in this ecological system and all that. You realized that it wasn't something that a lot of people were patronizing in. So even though it looked fruitful and then you were getting grants and all that, what was still motivating you? Because I mean, at the end, are you still gonna did you have plans of working in Nigeria, or you thought that probably because the grants are coming, you might end up? Because these are things that people think about, they would like to know it from the researchers. How do you get to choose your topic? How do you start getting your interest? Maybe you could help
That's
someone.
an interesting question. Okay. In Nigeria, ecology, the studying of ecology, so to say, is not patronized. In fact, uh, if you are studying single honor, you are seen as somebody who has lost focus, somebody who can have a better future. So people rush for these professional courses like medicine, engineering, pharmacy, nursing, where you tend to earn big money. But what actually made me to have the passion to go into it was, aside getting the grants, I saw a lot of opportunity to create a niche for myself.
Okay.
Because, okay, this is an area where it's not competitive in where I come from. So if I create a niche for myself, then I can be able to go further with less struggling at home, but more struggling abroad.
Exactly.
Because ecology is the hotspot in the developed countries.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's one of the areas that you have to convince the principal investigator that you have the knowledge for him to accept,
Yeah.
because it's an area with so much funding. But you must have to have good questions. And in ecology, one thing that also drives me crazy in this field is it's difficult to formulate a question. And growing up, I love difficulty. Yeah. So for you to formulate a good ecological question that will not only be good but have relevance, it takes a good time.
Mm.
You have to read wide, you have to interact with the environment and know what is going on. You cannot just sit in your room and imagine ecology. You will
Exactly.
develop a question that you will fail woefully. You will think it's an interesting question, but actually it's a bad question because it won't have any ecological effect.
Yeah.
So these were some of the things that made me more interested
Mm-hmm.
in ecology. The fact that, okay, you could get support in terms of funds, even though not from my own country, but there are a lot of uh, wealthy individuals who have created a lot of funds for researches into ecology, because we have, in the last, let me say, 100 years, experienced rapid decline in species diversity. A lot of species are being threatened and are going into extinction.
Mm-hmm.
What are the drivers of this extinction is something that is largely unknown, because species are, now what affects species A, it's not applicable to species B. So until you are able to pin the driver of a particular species, you will just be hitting a policy that will not be giving resultant effect.
Mm-hmm.
So
Interesting.
this made me more interested in ecology.
Yeah. Let me quickly ask you this. Africa has a very rich biodiversity, right? So
Yeah.
my my question now is, why is it that we don't have a lot of people? Okay, in your mind or in your
Mm.
own view, what do you think is the reason why people are not patronizing this, even though it's a very hot spot? I mean, it's very evident in our region. Everywhere you go, there is a different set of species, and it's very diverse across the continent. So why don't we patronize it that much?
A good question. Now, let me give you a little background, then I'll answer your question.
Okay, perfect.
Africa is, as the last study that was conducted, accounting for 11% of the whole total biodiversity,
Mm.
making it a very hot spot. Now, however, evolutionarily also, a lot of species that are in the temperate region, especially for plants, are origins of African species. They migrated from Africa through seed dispersal by animals and other stuff. Now, to come to your question now, the reason and the basic reason that we lack patronage of ecology is one, the educational system of Africa does not fit diversity. Now, a lot of politics is being played around with some professions.
Yeah.
Where in Africa, they place so much premium on some specific professions, forgetting the basic sciences. And it is the basic sciences that derive or that drives home accurate results. For instance, talking about Nigeria, like I said in my opening statement, if you are studying biology, nobody sees you as if you are studying it. And that's why in the last years, a lot of people have gone in to apply for medicine because they know that, okay, if you study medicine, you finish, you are going to work in a hospital.
Yeah.
And
Even
you earn
parents,
good money.
even the
And
families and the parents. Yeah.
yeah, I was a victim. In fact, it was a talk of war with my family for me to be able to continue to read my ecology because they believe that it was a misplaced priority.
Yeah.
That I cannot be funding your education and you will be reading what will not be relevant tomorrow. And so that's our cultural background in Africa, our educational settings, our political settings all contributes to the negative attitude towards ecology.
Yeah.
And it's really doing us very bad.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very bad.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I would like to say that congratulations for all the achievements that you have been able to make. I think recently you even sent me a picture of one of the awards that you picked up. And I'm really excited that people that will be listening to this and kids that will come in, the youth that are growing up will know that, well, this is an area that we can also patronize. And so you'll be an encouragement to a lot of people because I see with your background, you are currently focusing on morphological and physiological micro evolution of biodiversity, and you are interested in how evolution of some species and traits contribute to the adaptive plasticity of reptiles, right? And it's very interesting. And I was looking around for someone to just discuss this topic with, and I just felt like you will be one of the best persons to just discuss this. So today I would like to just draw a background and we can get into today's discussion, because where we've already started from, I think there are a lot of things to talk about. We'll leave that for another day. Yeah. So today basically we want to just get into the relation between climate change and its impact on biodiversity, right? And in the first place, I'm sure there are a lot of people who've been listening to this and they might not know what biodiversity is. Could you give us a brief background of what this is, and maybe define certain terms that we'll be using so that people don't just get like, hey, what are you guys talking about? But it's really something basic that we all have to know that is just around us. So in simple terms, what is biodiversity and what are the importance of biodiversity?
Thank you, David, for the congratulations on my award, which I shared with you. So to go straight to your question, when we are talking about biodiversity, it's not a big term that should be difficult, or that it's just the simple diversity in the biological system. Now, the biological system is a system that is so complex because we have species that make up what we call the biodiversity. And the differences that brings about biodiversity go down to what we call the genes. The genes of plants, animal, microorganisms, fungi are what actually make plants to be plants, animals to be animals, microorganisms to be microorganisms. So when we are talking about biodiversity, we are referring to the diversity or the differences, the enormous differences in the biological system. And so to give a better understanding is when you look at plants, plants are far different from animals, and animals are far different from microorganisms. But each of these have an important role they play in the ecosystem or in their environment. For instance, a common example is in the gaseous exchange, where we give the plants the carbon dioxide, which they use as one of their products during photosynthesis. And the plants clean up the atmosphere for us by taking away that carbon dioxide. And then the byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, which we need. Now, talking about the microorganisms, which now, for us to have a good soil, we must have humus, which are as a result of decomposition from either dead plants or animals. Now, some of these microorganisms are what helps in decomposing the dead plants and animals for us to have a fertile soil for the plants to grow. So you can see that the cycle is important for the earth system to continue to live. Because if you take away plants from the equation, then you are taking away source of food, you are taking away source of removal of carbon dioxide from the earth system. And if we have excess carbon dioxide, there is problem. If we don't have food, definitely animals will die of starvation. So also now, the animals also give back to the earth system by their waste, which is also nutritional to the plants. And they also serve as source of food. And so the food chain and the food web, it's a complex cycle. And that's why biodiversity is very, very important in every issue that we talk about. We cannot talk about life, the existence of life, without going down to biodiversity. And that's the most important thing that you see a lot of governments, like I said in my earlier statement, putting more funding in preserving their biodiversity so as to have clean energy, so as to have good water source, so as to have good health. Now, let me give you this brief good news that research have shown that people who live where there are more plants actually live longer because they have clean oxygen they take in, clean air, and you also see them, they flourish. It's not about the food you eat, but about the system you live in, the environment you live in. It's very, very important. Some of the diseases we have these days are as a result of some distortion of the mechanism in the cell cycle. And how do we have a distortion in the mechanism of the cell cycle? Is when there is an intervention of a particular chemical or an unknown chemical that comes in to disrupt the actual reproduction of the cell system. Then you have the outgrown number of cells just reproducing without a pattern, and then you result into having cancer. So we have a lot of issues around biodiversity that it's just than meeting the eye.
Yeah, It's very,
It's more
very
than just
interesting.
meeting the eye.
So, in a nutshell, you mean that biodiversity, if I want to picture it in a very graphical form, I see that nature on its own has presented a cycle where it has
Yes,
placed certain species at the edges and at specific positions on this cycle. And at those positions, these species or specific, let's say, plants or animals or microbes are perform a certain specific performance, which helps the cycle to be complete. So anyone that is removed by any activity of the other, it affects the other practically. We mean that in this ecosystem, everyone depends on the other to exist. So we realize that in the ecosystem, or let's say in biodiversity, all the species are living peacefully. But then it looks like there is this one particular species, humans, who are continuously doing things doing things in such a way to impact the other ones negatively without necessarily really taking a look at it again. And I know that there are so many things that affect biodiversity. I'll just leave it up to you for you to dig into them, just briefly mention them. But today we would like to specifically talk about climate change and what it. But before we dig into that, what are some of the human activities and what are some of the things aside climate change that are impacting biodiversity negatively?
okay. Uh, Let me talk from the point of view of the highest authority we have in biodiversity research. That's the
Okay.
Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem.
Okay.
That's uh, an organization which is part of the UN that controls the whole issues around biodiversity. And they were very clear on what are some of the things that negatively drives biodiversity to extinction. One, human activity. Two, we have pollution, we have climate change, we have what we call invasive species or more of alien species. So these are the key major factors that drives biodiversity towards the negative side. Now, let me just give a brief overview of each of these. Now,
Okay.
when we talk about alien species, these are species that have or are or not originally from the environment they are. But when they get into the environment, they begin to cause harm to the native species.
Mm.
And so harm in terms of competition for resources, harm in terms of being predators to some of those species. And then you tend to see the species will either have to migrate from its own native land to another population where it will now have to start thinking of one, adapting, which is a great cost to the species itself. Because when we talk about adaptation, it's a broad word I don't want to go into, but
Into
it's
now.
just the ability to live in the environment. Because physiologically, it will have to adapt. Biochemically, it will have to adapt. Life history-wise, it will have to do some trade-offs. Now, that is just for the pollution.
Can you give a vivid example of this aliens?
A very good example of the alien species, if you talk about in the animals, some of the annelid reptiles, lizards that we have, and some of the snake species also. We all know that snakes feed on other animals, like the frogs.
Yeah.
So when they go into the environment, they become predators. And so they drive those frogs or those small reptiles into hiding. Now, when they drive those into hiding, what they are doing is one, they are reducing their foraging behavior. Foraging behavior is very important to a species. That's the foraging behavior is when the time that the species goes to feed, and also aside feeding, takes some interact with the environment. Now, when the foraging behavior is reduced, that means feeding time is reduced.
Okay.
When feeding time is reduced, that means life history pattern of the species is
It's also
gradually reducing.
reducing.
So that is one of the effects that you could also have. But more of the example of alien species and invasive species are found in plants, whereby you see a plant that will be deposited here as a result of seed dispersal. Give it 5 years, it takes over the whole environment. What happens to the grass species, the grasses that were there? It has dominated and it will create a canopy cover. In creating a canopy cover, it is already depriving the
Small
smaller
ones from
species
growing.
from the resources of the ecosystem. And so the small ones are either driven into extinction or are reduced in growth, which affects their morphology, physiology, evolution, and other stuff.
So that even means that companies that are into planting of trees should actually really consider the places that they plant trees, because there might be certain species that are known to be there and comfortable there. But if we plant trees just anywhere, anyhow, just in the mindset of planting trees, we are actually depriving those native species from growing. Ah, that's very interesting. I never thought of that.
Yeah, and that's why, we in the ecological aspect, we do argue that before any company or government goes into certain interventions, you need to do the ecological or environmental impact assessment. Now, if you do the impact assessment, that will give you an idea on what are the species on ground, what are some of the factors affecting them, what are the species that in history have deprived these species from growing. If we introduce this species, what is the competition rate? All these questions need to be answered before some. But a lot of these companies that just go to just plant trees, plant this, because now let me tell you one sad story, that we are focusing on the wrong thing than the right thing. What am I trying to say? The savanna is more important to us than the forest. But a lot of time, monies is being chunked into making forests and not the savanna. Now, when you have a forest, you are automatically depriving shrubs and grasses and other species that are of the lower cadre their right to live in. But when you have a savanna, you have all the representatives of the species. You have the tall trees, the woody trees that are sparsely scattered. You have the shrubs, you have the grasses, you have so the savanna is richer in ecosystem, or is richer and it's more better for the ecosystem than the forest. But most times, policymakers and companies just run into planting deciduous trees. In planting deciduous trees, you are converting places that are supposed to be savannas to become forests. And what you are doing is automatically reducing the servicing of the ecosystem. How many of the woody plants are of very essential importance? Very few. All we do with them is timber. But a lot of these shrubs and grasses are medicinal. Aside being medicinal, they are raw materials to a lot of products. And then we also use them for animal feeding, which is also important. But when you have a forest, what percentage of the ecosystem will benefit from the forest? So talking about the pollution now, pollution is also one big effect on the biodiversity. And based on the report of IBIS that was released late 2019, it showed that presently we have 400 part of the ocean that is dead. That means it can't support life. And when the study tried to quantify per kilometer the land area, it's about 250 53,000 kilometers square. That's almost the landmass of UK, the Great Britain. So that is to say, our plastic pollution, which is being produced by the industry, and then also which we contribute in disposing anyhow without proper waste management, is reducing or has successfully rendered the whole biodiversity, assumingly in Britain, out of existence. Because if we have a landmass of 250,000 kilometers square, which is the size of, almost the size of Britain, that cannot support life, then it shows that there is great danger for the biodiversity that we have. And based on that, 60% of the whole ocean has already been taken away.
60%
of the, if you compare, this data I'm telling you is from the 1500 to 2018. 60% of the ocean has already been taken by human activity based on introduction of plastics into the marine environment and other activities that, so you can see that the biodiversity is at risk from pollution. And for the freshwater, it's also another thing that we don't even want to imagine, because the great danger being done on the freshwater, it's unimaginable. Now, a lot of fish farmers use the inappropriate way of fish harvesting, get their fish, and by doing that, there is the introduction of chemicals that are very harmful to the ecosystem. And so we are already affecting the life of the fishes. Apart from that, the waste influx from the industries also passes through the freshwater. Most of the freshwater are tributaries of the either estuarine or have some of their sources linked to the marine environment. So pollution is driving a lot of species to be threatened. And then the other one, which is climate change, which we are going to.
Before you get into climate change, we the two of us are part of a group that is writing this, doing some research on microplastics. And just recently, I saw an article that has been published talking about, it has been published by Nature. And it's surprising that this paper is talking about that microplastics has a negligible impact on the ecosystem in the ocean. You, as an expert in ecology, and you have done research from a bachelor level to a PhD level in the evolution of how human activities are impacting the traits of these species. What would you say to that? Because I was very surprised to see such a heading, a title, and I read into details, and in the abstract of this paper, it's saying that, well, if the microplastics get smaller, the impact might increase. But for now, they can say that the impact on microplastics generally on the ecosystem in the ocean is negligible.
Yeah, there are a lot of arguments along these microplastics. And so a lot of people share different sentiments. But the fact remains that microplastics have an effect. However, they don't have much effect like the plastics themselves, just like the paper suggested. And I will give you a very short example or an instance. There are studies that have shown that when these plastics degrade and they become very minute, they are being taken in by the aquatic organisms. But the aquatic organisms have developed some sort of physiological mechanisms that they can live with it for a very long time, even though it affects some of their physiological pattern, but it doesn't immediately kill them, or it doesn't result to death immediately. So a lot of these aquatic organisms have developed a means of living with them. However, it will have a much effect in the later future. But when you talk about now the larger plastics, where if they ingest, they are not able to digest, that can block their digestive system and it will result to death. So arguably, it's still a topic of discourse and arguments, but somebody can argue that yes, they have effect, but the much effect, if compared, is more from the plastics than the microplastics. So that's why you could see such a study sailing through even in it.
The plastics have this absorption characteristics where they can absorb certain chemicals or probably certain things that might be in the water or probably the ocean. The organisms might not have taken them in, but when these plastics are available in the ocean, they absorb them and then they get inside them and then they can be released with them. So that could also be another area where it could impact it. But it's a very interesting area that I think this argument will keep going on.
To add up to what you just said, and that's one of the reasons that people argue that plastics are more dangerous, because plastics have the ability of emitting chemicals, but not microplastics. And a lot of these chemicals are what give a lot of effect, especially our bisphenol A, for instance. That is a chemical from plastics, not microplastics. So if you have organisms that take in bisphenol A, they are the risk of death than organisms that take in very minute microplastics. So that's the argument. Just like you say, it's still an argument in the marine pollution area of research that people will still need to throw in their weight and show evidences using experimental data.
But if you had to give your final take, what would that be?
If I'm to give my final take, let's try as much as possible to take away plastics and microplastics from there, instead of trying to say which one is much better, since both have effect and both affects the aquatic organisms. Let us not look for, it's just like saying that we prefer the devil than the deep ocean. It's still going to result to death after all.
Is that a Nigerian proverb?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a Nigerian proverb where if you are faced between the devil and the deep ocean, which one will you prefer? But I used to tell them that for me as an ecologist, I would prefer the deep ocean because at least I will give back to the ecosystem, because I will decompose and then I will serve as manna to the ecosystem instead of the devil to consume me without any effect, without any importance. But that's just on the light note.
So that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us today on this episode, and we hope that you grabbed something. Next week, we are still with Gideon, continuing with climate change and its impact on biodiversity. See you on the next episode. Until then, live green.